My brother Tommy's hands wrapped around my throat in his own living room, and his teenage children just watched from the stairs. The argument started over our late mother's will, a small thing about an old silver locket that turned ugly fast. One minute, we were just talking. The next, he shoved me back into the couch. His face was a mask of pure rage, all twisted and red. I saw his kids, my niece and nephew, sitting frozen on the steps, their eyes wide like dinner plates. They didn't scream. They didn't move. They just stared as my vision started to get blurry from the lack of air. He thought I was just an old man, easy to push around. But as he squeezed, I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. I was about to teach him and his silent children what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. I staggered out of his front door that day, gasping for air, swearing he'd never see me powerless again. I drove home with the car windows down, even though the Ohio winter air was biting cold. I needed to feel something other than the ghost of his fingers on my skin. My neck throbbed with a dull ache, but the pain in my pride was sharper. I sat in my quiet house, the house I grew up in, and waited for the phone to ring. I expected a call from him, maybe a clumsy apology fueled by guilt, or maybe a call from his wife, trying to smooth things over. I even thought one of the kids might text me, but my phone remained silent. The silence was louder than his shouting had been. It was a cold, hard confirmation that to them, what had happened didn't matter. The assault, the fear, the disrespect, it was nothing. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I kept seeing their blank faces, their quiet acceptance of his violence. The silence wasn't just a lack of an apology, it was their verdict. I was disposable. I got out of bed, went to my old desk, and began writing down everything he owed me, every favor, every single dollar. In the dusty corner of my office, I pulled out a stack of old notebooks and ledger books from my mechanic days. My fingers, stained with a lifetime of grease and oil, flipped through the brittle pages. I wasn't just looking for memories. I was looking for proof. And I found it. There was the receipt from 2009 when I paid his mortgage for 3 months after he lost his job. I found the IOU he scribbled on a napkin for the $5,000 I lent him to fix his truck. I even found old text messages I'd saved, where he promised to pay me back for the loan I co-signed when his credit was shot. As I added up the numbers, my hands started to shake. The total was over $47,000. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't just been his older brother, helping him out. I had been his safety net, his crutch, his endless bank account. He built his comfortable life on my sacrifices. I stared at the final number, and a cold clarity washed over me. I wasn't going to ask for repayment. I was going to collect it another way. The next morning, I walked into the local credit union, my steps more determined than they had been in years. I wasn't there to withdraw money. I was there to claim a piece of my past. I sat down with a young woman named Brenda who had kind eyes and a patient smile. I explained that I needed to look at the original property deeds our mother left us when she passed away. She tapped on her keyboard, her brow furrowed in concentration as she pulled up the old county records. After a few minutes, she turned the monitor toward me. "This is interesting, Mr. Walters," she said. "It seems your brother never properly filed his portion of the inheritance. Your name is still listed as a co-owner on one of the undeveloped lots directly behind his house." My heart skipped a beat. It was a tiny piece of land, barely a quarter acre, but it was a legal loophole he had overlooked in his arrogance. For the first time since he laid his hands on me, I felt a spark of control ignite in my chest. I walked out of that bank smiling, the cold winter air feeling crisp and clean. Control felt good. It felt like putting on a pair of old, reliable work gloves. My first stop was the city zoning office, a stuffy room filled with maps and the smell of old paper. I walked up to the counter and calmly applied for an independent property fence permit for the lot behind Tommy's house. The clerk, a man with a tired expression, barely looked up. He checked the records, saw my name on the deed, and stamped my application without a single question. It was all perfectly legal, all by the book. My right. A week later, a crew of surveyors arrived. I stood on my side of the property line and watched them hammer wooden stakes into the ground. They ran a bright orange string right through the middle of the backyard where my niece and nephew used to play. They watched from their kitchen window, their faces pale with confusion. Soon enough, Tommy came storming out of his back door, his face turning a familiar shade of red. "What the hell is this, Frank? You can't do this," he roared. I just looked at him calmly and said, "Actually, I can." Tommy marched across the freshly drawn property line until he was standing inches from my face, trying to use his size to intimidate me, just like he had in the living room. But something was different this time. I didn't flinch. I didn't back down an inch. I just held his furious gaze. The man who had choked me was standing right there, but the power had shifted. His children, drawn out by the shouting, stood nervously on their back porch. Their eyes darted between me and their father, their confusion turning into a quiet fear. Instead of shouting back, I reached into the folder I was holding and pulled out a crisp sheet of legal paperwork. I didn't say a word. I simply handed it to him. The paper was quiet, final, and more powerful than any punch I could have thrown. He snatched it from my hand and glanced at it, ready to tear it up. But then he stopped. He threw the papers on the ground in a rage, but one specific line, one clause written in dense legal text, caught his eye, and it drained all the color from his face. The clause was simple and brutal. It was a section from the county's property laws that I had the clerk at the zoning office highlight for me. It stated that since he had been using a portion of my legally owned land for over a decade, his shed, his garden, even part of his driveway, he was technically trespassing. I had the legal right to either file for his eviction from my section or, even better, charge him for 10 years of back rent. He looked up from the paper, his eyes wide with disbelief. The arrogant bully I knew was gone, replaced by a scared man. "You wouldn't," he whispered, his voice cracking. The words hung in the cold air between us. I thought about the feeling of his hands on my neck, the sight of his children watching in silence. I thought about the years of being taken for granted, of being the family fool. I took a deep breath and let the cold, hard truth settle over him. "I wouldn't have," I said, my voice steady as stone. "But you changed all that in the living room." News of the fence and the legal notice spread through our family like wildfire. My phone started buzzing with calls and texts from cousins and aunts I hadn't spoken to in years. The family split right down the middle. Some called me cruel, saying I was tearing the family apart over a petty squabble. They said Tommy had a temper, but he was still my brother. Others whispered that it was about time. They said I had been letting Tommy walk all over me for decades, and that he finally got what was coming to him. My niece, a smart girl who always saw things clearly, sent me a text that said, "Grandpa says Uncle Tom is losing his mind. Be careful." I read her message but didn't reply. This wasn't about winning a family argument or creating gossip. It was about principle. It was about drawing a line in the sand, literally. I was reclaiming the respect he had choked out of me. Then, one evening, I found a letter in my mailbox, tucked between the bills and the junk mail. The handwriting was neat and familiar. It was from Tommy's wife. I opened the letter from his wife, Karen, expecting more anger, more accusations. But her words were different. They were soft, pleading. She wrote about the children, saying they were traumatized enough by the fighting. She begged me to reconsider, to think about the family, and find a peaceful way to resolve this. For a moment, her words hit their mark. I felt a pang of guilt. Were the kids really suffering because of my actions? I almost picked up the phone to call it all off. But then the memory from that Sunday afternoon flooded back into my mind, sharp and suffocating. I saw her children standing on the stairs, their faces blank, their mouths shut. They were silent as their father choked me. That image, that chilling silence, hardened my heart again. They weren't just innocent bystanders. They were witnesses who chose to do nothing. I took out a fresh piece of paper and a pen. My hand was steady as I wrote her back one single, clear line. "Tell your husband to apologize to me in front of them." I sealed it and put it in the mail the next morning. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Tommy. His voice was flat, without any real emotion. "Karen said you want an apology," he began. "So fine. I'm sorry. If I say sorry, will that be enough to fix your precious pride?" The sarcasm in his voice was so thick I could almost taste it. It was a mock apology, a performance meant to satisfy his wife, not to offer me any real remorse. He was still the same arrogant man who thought he could fix everything with empty words. He didn't understand that this was never just about my pride. It was about his lack of character. "It's only enough if you mean it, Tommy," I said quietly, giving him one last chance to be a decent human being. There was a pause on the line, and then he let out a short, bitter laugh. It was a laugh that said, You're a fool if you think I actually feel sorry." Then he hung up. I stood there in my kitchen, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. That single, heartless laugh was all the confirmation I needed. I was done waiting for him to change. I was going through with the next step. The next morning, I drove down to the county courthouse. The air was cold, but my resolve was solid as ice. I walked into the clerk's office and officially filed the eviction notice. It wasn't just a threat on a piece of paper anymore. It was now a public record, a legal action that could not be ignored. In a small town like ours, news travels fast, especially when it involves family drama and property disputes. Just as I expected, the local town paper picked up the story. It was a small article buried in the back pages, but in our community, it was front-page news. The headline was simple: "Local man faces eviction from family property." Suddenly, everyone knew. Everyone at the grocery store, the post office, the diner, they all knew that Tommy Walters had attacked his own brother and was now in danger of losing half of his yard because of it. The public humiliation was a weapon I hadn't wanted to use, but he had left me no choice. The very next morning, as I was drinking my coffee, I saw his truck pull into my driveway. He got out and walked to my door, his shoulders slumped. He was crying. I opened my front door to find my younger brother, the same man who had laughed at me on the phone, standing on my porch with tears streaming down his face. His tough guy act had completely crumbled. The public shame had done what my pain could not. "Frank, please," he sobbed, his voice thick with desperation. "You can't do this. Everyone is talking. My kids are getting asked about it at school." Before I could respond, he dropped to his knees right there on my weathered porch, begging me for a truce. For a split second, I saw the little boy I had helped raise after our dad died. The boy I protected, the boy I loved. A wave of pity washed over me, and I almost gave in. But pity is a dangerous thing when your pride is still bleeding. I reached down and helped him to his feet. His hands were cold and trembling. I looked him straight in the eye and said, my voice quiet but firm, "You had your chance to make this right, Tommy." I turned and walked back inside, closing the door on his pleas. That night, as I sat in the dark, my phone lit up with a private message. It was from his oldest son. The message on my phone glowed in the darkness of my living room. It was from my nephew, Jason. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. The text was short, but every word carried the weight of years of fear. "I'm sorry, Uncle Frank. I'm sorry we didn't do anything. We were scared. Dad's been like that for years." My chest tightened as I read the words over and over. Been like that for years. A cold dread trickled down my spine. I had seen their silence as a betrayal, as them taking his side. I never once considered that their silence was a symptom of something much darker. They weren't being cruel. They were being careful. They were terrified of him, just as I had been in that moment on the couch. My anger toward them melted away, replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. This wasn't just about me and Tommy anymore. It was about his family, about the children living in a house where their father's rage was a constant threat. I suddenly realized my quest for revenge might end up saving more than just my own pride. It might just save them. Jason's text message changed everything. It was like a key that unlocked a door I never even knew was there. The next day, I drove through Tommy's neighborhood, but I didn't stop at his house. Instead, I pulled up to the curb a few doors down, at the home of an old acquaintance, Mrs. Gable. She was a kind woman who had lived on that street for 30 years and saw everything. I asked her about Tommy, about his temper. At first, she was hesitant, not wanting to get involved in family business. But when I told her I was worried about the kids, her expression softened. She told me she had seen bruises on Karen's arms a few times over the years, marks she tried to hide with long sleeves, even in the summer. She spoke of loud arguments that would suddenly go silent. Suddenly, the scene in the living room took on a terrifying new meaning. His attack on me wasn't a one-time outburst caused by an argument. It was part of a pattern of violence and intimidation that had been happening behind closed doors for years. I started documenting everything. I went home and created a new file. I labeled it simply Evidence. Inside, I placed a printed copy of Jason's text message. I wrote down the date and time of my conversation with Mrs. Gable, detailing everything she had told me about the bruises and the arguments. I started going through old photos, looking for any signs I might have missed. In one picture from a family barbecue 2 years ago, I noticed Karen was wearing a turtleneck sweater on a hot July day. At the time, I thought it was strange, but now it seemed sinister. I didn't know if I would ever take this folder to the police or use it in court, but I needed to have it. Every piece of paper, every note, every memory I documented was a piece of the power he had stolen from me and from his family. It was leverage. It was proof. I was no longer just fighting for my dignity. I was building a case to protect the people he was supposed to love. Then came the night he crossed the line again. This time, it wasn't with me. The phone call came just after 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. It was Mrs. Gable, her voice shaking with fear. "Frank, you need to get over here. They're screaming. It's bad this time." I told her to call 911 immediately and got in my truck. By the time I arrived, the street was already painted in flashing red and blue lights. 2 police cars were parked crookedly in front of Tommy's house, their strobing lights illuminating the faces of worried neighbors who had gathered on their lawns. I saw the front door open, and 2 officers led Tommy out in handcuffs. He wasn't yelling or fighting anymore. He looked small and defeated under the harsh glare of the police lights. Then, I saw Karen coming out behind them, an officer gently guiding her by the arm. She had a cut on her lip, and she was trying to hide her face. The whole neighborhood saw it. The perfect family facade that Tommy had worked so hard to maintain had finally, publicly, shattered. I sat in my truck across the street, a silent witness, knowing that karma had finally clocked in for its shift. His daughter, my niece Amelia, called me an hour later from a neighbor's house. Her voice was small and shaky, broken by sobs. "They're taking Dad away," she cried into the phone. "They arrested him." I listened quietly, letting her get all the fear and confusion out. I didn't offer empty words of comfort or tell her everything would be okay, because I wasn't sure it would be. Instead, when she paused to take a breath, I said 2 simple words. "You're safe now." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her processing what I had said. It wasn't an accusation or a judgment. It was a statement of fact. For the first time in what was probably a very long time, her father was not in the house, and she was safe from his anger. When she finally spoke again, her sobs had subsided, and for the first time, I heard a faint trace of relief in her voice. "Yeah," she whispered. "We are." The next day, my phone rang again. This time, it was a man with a serious voice who introduced himself as Karen's lawyer. The lawyer's name was Mr. Harrison, and he spoke in a calm, professional tone. He explained that Karen was filing for a divorce and had a restraining order against Tommy. Then he said something that completely stunned me. "Mrs. Walters would like to offer you a deal, Frank," he said. "She knows about the property dispute. As part of her divorce settlement, she wants to transfer her legal portion of the entire property over to you." I was speechless. She wanted to give me her share of the house and the land. He explained that it was her way of thanking me. My actions with the fence and the legal notice had forced a confrontation that finally exposed Tommy's abuse and gave her the strength to leave. It was her way of cutting all ties to him and the life he had built. My first instinct was to decline. I had never wanted his house. I just wanted my respect back. But the lawyer insisted. Karen saw it as a form of justice, a way to ensure Tommy lost everything he had taken for granted, including his home. After a long moment of silence, I accepted, but with one important promise attached. "I'll accept the property," I told Mr. Harrison over the phone, but on one condition. I explained my promise to him, and he relayed it to Karen. I wasn't going to live in that house, filled with its dark memories. I wasn't going to sell it to strangers who knew nothing of the pain it held. Instead, I promised her that I would tear it down. I would clear the land of the structure where so much fear had taken root. In its place, I would build something peaceful, something positive. There would be no bitterness, no angry reminders of the past. There would only be new growth. Through her lawyer, Karen agreed. She said the thought of the house being gone forever brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. A week later, after all the legal papers were signed and the property was officially mine, a line of large, yellow demolition trucks rumbled down the quiet suburban street. Neighbors came out of their houses to watch, whispering among themselves as the machines took their positions. The house where my brother choked me was about to be erased from the earth. The demolition was loud and violent, but the sound was oddly calming to me. I stood across the street and watched as a massive excavator clawed at the roof, tearing away shingles and wood like they were paper. The walls where family photos once hung crumbled into dust. The living room, the site of my humiliation, was ripped open to the sky. With every crash and every shatter of glass, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. I wasn't just watching a house fall. I was watching the destruction of a monument to pain and fear. Tommy had boasted about that house. He saw it as a symbol of his success, a castle for his perfect family. Now, it was just a pile of broken boards and shattered dreams. I thought about how sometimes in life, you have to tear everything down to the foundation before you can even think about rebuilding. It's a messy, destructive process, but it's the only way to make room for something new. Amid the rubble and the dust, as the crew was clearing the debris, one of the workers called out to me. He had found something unexpected. The worker held up a small, dirt-covered frame. I walked over and took it from him, wiping the dust away with my thumb. It was an old photograph of me and Tommy as young boys. We couldn't have been more than 10 or 12 years old. We were standing in our dad's garage, covered from head to toe in grease, with huge, proud smiles on our faces. My arm was slung around his smaller shoulders. We had just finished helping our dad fix the engine of his old Ford pickup. I remembered that day. I remembered the feeling of teamwork, of being brothers who had each other's backs. I stood there in the middle of all that destruction, holding this small piece of our shared past. A wave of grief washed over me. Grief for the boys we used to be, for the bond we had lost. But underneath the grief, there was also a sense of peace. That part of our life was truly over. Looking at the empty lot, I knew exactly what I had to do. I was going to build something on that land, not for me, but for the kids. It took the better part of a year, but the project slowly took shape. I used the money from the settlement and dipped into my own savings, the money I was no longer spending on Tommy's life. On the land where his house once stood, I built a small, clean, and functional community workshop. It wasn't fancy, just a simple 2-bay garage filled with good tools and bright lights. I put a sign out front that read, Walter's Community Garage, free repairs for single moms and elderly neighbors. I wanted to turn a place of abuse into a place of help. On the clean, white wall of the small office, I hung just one thing. The old, framed photograph of me and Tommy as boys, covered in grease and smiling. The workshop had been open for about a month when, one quiet afternoon, the door creaked open. I looked up from the engine I was working on and saw my nephew, Jason, standing in the doorway. He looked older, calmer than the last time I had seen him. The fear in his eyes was gone. Jason stood there for a moment, just looking around the workshop. He took in the clean floors, the organized tools, and the bright lights. His eyes finally landed on the photograph hanging on the wall. "Uncle Frank," he said, his voice quiet but steady. He walked over to me, his hands in his pockets. "I just wanted to see what you built." I wiped my greasy hands on a rag and nodded toward a stool. "Pull up a seat," I said. We sat in a comfortable silence for a few minutes before he spoke again. "Dad's in a rehab program. He's been there for 6 months. He's different." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "He wanted me to tell you something. He said he remembers that photo, too. He remembers that day." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. We shook hands then. A firm, adult handshake, not the awkward greeting of a scared boy and an angry uncle. As he got up to leave, he glanced one last time at the picture on the wall and whispered, "He destroyed a lot of things, but you built something good out of him." A few months after Jason's visit, a letter with an unfamiliar postmark arrived. The return address was a treatment center a few states away. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky, but I recognized it immediately. It was from Tommy. I sat at my kitchen table and hesitated before opening it, unsure if I was ready for what was inside. It wasn't an apology, not in the way I had once demanded. It was something deeper, something more honest. It was a letter of reflection. He wrote about his anger, about the man he had become without even realizing it. He admitted what he did to me in the living room, and he said that the memory of his children's silent, terrified faces haunted him every single day. He wrote that their silence was the loudest wake-up call of his life, making him realize that he had become the one thing our father always taught us never to be, a bully. At the very end of the letter, he wrote a line that stuck with me. "You took my land, Frank, but you gave me back a mirror to see my own reflection." Last week, Karen and the kids invited me over for dinner. They live in a small apartment now, a place that feels cozy and safe. The air was different. There was laughter, easy and light. We ate at their small dining table, and for the first time in years, I felt like a part of their family, not just a financial lifeline. After dinner, I sat in their new living room, calm and unafraid. My niece, Amelia, showed me the A+ she got on a history paper, and Jason talked about joining the mechanics program at the local community college. There were no hands around my neck this time, only looks of genuine gratitude in their eyes. As I was leaving, Karen gave me a hug and thanked me. I looked at Tommy's children, no longer silent witnesses, but survivors who were learning to heal. I realized that my quest for revenge had grown into something I never expected. It had become a reckoning, a painful but necessary series of events that had finally, against all odds, set every single one of us free.